There you go. 4-punch, 5-punch, 6-punch combination. Body shot, bang, 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 bang.
Telling him not to counterpunch.
Boom! Will Rackman get up?
Iron. You're going through all the instructions. This is for the championship of the world. I expect a tough, clean fight. Protect yourself at all times. Any questions from the challenger?
Welcome back, fight fans, for the Fight City Podcast first show of 2022. I'm your host, Alden Kodash, and I hope everyone had a great New Year's and is as optimistic as I am for what boxing has in store for 2022. For our first show, we're going to feature an exclusive interview with Steve Geffrard, the man who just this past weekend received a call on 1 week's notice telling him that he'll be fighting Joe Smith Jr. for the WBO light heavyweight title, stepping in for Callum Johnson, who unfortunately tested positive for COVID. Following that interview, we're going to have a slice of heavyweight history I know you'll enjoy when Carbert and Hunter Breckenridge talk about some of the most underrated heavyweight rivalries in boxing history. Stay tuned. So next up we have Steve Geffrard, who has just been informed yesterday that he'll be fighting for the WBO light heavyweight championship of the world. Well, first of all, congratulations, Steve. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
So it's not every day that you get a call asking you on a week's notice if you want to fight for the championship of the world, kind of like Rocky-esque. So if you could take us through what happened when you woke up on Friday morning to when you accepted to fight Joe Smith Jr.
Yeah, I woke up, I did my thing. It was like early in the morning. I did my morning run. Then I was in the sauna at Delray Boxing, and my coach calls me. He's like, my coach Kevin Cunningham, he called me. He's like, man, you're not going to believe this. I want you to fight for the title, the WBO world title, because someone got sick or something. And I was like, wow, it didn't really hit me right that second, but it was like, wow.
Callum Johnson originally slated to fight, pulled out due to COVID. Was there any hesitation in your mind of whether or not to take this fight on a week notice, or was it just a clear-cut decision?
Yeah, well, my phone was about to die when I was talking to my coach, but I said, let me call you back, and I plugged it in, and then I told him, I texted him, I called my friend Erickson Lubin, told him about it. He was like, yeah, man, this is an opportunity of a lifetime. He was like, man, this is unreal, man. And then, I just texted my coach, and I was like, yeah, man, let's do it. And then within a few hours, everything was signed, and boom, now it's fight week.
Yep. So, it's been heard it said many times that it's so important to stay in shape year-round because you never know when the phone's going to ring and you'll have an opportunity like this. In your case, you were previously scheduled to fight an 8-round contest this weekend. Now you're going into a 12-round contest. You've been scheduled to fight 12 rounds before in China against Dmitry Sakovsky. So how strategically does this sudden change play in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I wasn't preparing for a 12-round fight, but, this is boxing. You got to expect the unexpected. I'm just going to have to make adjustments as we go you just have to make adjustments as you go in the fight, nothing in boxing, not too much ever goes as planned, so just gonna have to make adjustments and figure out a way.
So Smith, he's been in with the better opposition as a pro, but you have a much better amateur pedigree in winning multiple national titles and almost making the 2012 Olympic team. On top of that, you've trained with some very top light heavyweights like Sergey Kovalev, Alida Alvarez, Artur Beterbiev, just to name a few. Does this all give you confidence that maybe Joe Smith Jr. is not necessarily as big a step up in class as most are deeming him to be?
Yeah, I mean, I know my skills I believe in my skills and stuff. I know my skills can match up with the best in the division. Obviously, I wasn't training for a 12-round world title fight, but, like you said, I was training. I'm not just coming out off the couch. So, at the end of the day, I'm a fighter, and, that switch, I'm going to have to just turn on that switch and lock in and get the job done,
Yeah. So you've worked with several elite trainers throughout your pro career, starting with Ronnie Shields and John David Jackson to more recently Derek Santos, and now you're with Kevin Cunningham. How have all the different approaches benefited you going into this fight, you think?
Oh, yeah. Kevin, he's a great coach. He's real militant. He's real motivational. He's worked with a lot of great champions. And, yeah, I'm going in there with a very experienced corner. So, it's now once the bell rings, it's up to me, to get the job done.
And win or lose, you have a chance to make a huge impression in front of the whole world on ESPN. And I'm also sure that the fact that you saved the show for them won't be forgotten by the top-ranked executives. How much energy does this give you going into this fight week and for the rest of your career?
Oh, it's a lot. It just shows you, man. Boxing, crazy things could happen, That's why it is really important to at least always be in the gym. All the young fighters, they should take this as an example to just always be in the gym, because this is, you can always get that one phone call that could change your life.
Expect a tough, clean fight. Protect yourself at all times. Any questions from the challenger?
This week, we are talking about heavyweight rivalries. And I am joined by site contributor and expert on heavyweight boxing, Hunter Breckenridge. And in wake of the fact that we have just seen, not too long ago, a significant heavyweight trilogy complete itself, 3 fights between Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury, and there's no question that they saved the best for last. Their third fight, which was won in dramatic fashion by Tyson Fury, a clean knockout for all intents and purposes. It was a fight that really made an impression, not just on boxing fans, but on sports fans. And Hunter and I, we started thinking, it's a significant heavyweight rivalry, a significant trilogy. What other heavyweight rivalries deserve a little more attention? And we want to go back and look at some of the heavyweight rivalries that maybe for many sports fans and even some diehard fight fans kind of have fly under the radar now. And so indulge us and join us on a trip back into boxing history as we look at some of the significant heavyweight rivalries of the past. And so I am joined for this podcast by Hunter Breckenridge, as mentioned. Hunter, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I always enjoy talking boxing.
Yes, and I think what we'll do is we'll kind of we'll start with the more recent underrated rivalry, and then we'll go back in time and back to a period in heavyweight history which I think both yourself, Hunter, and me regard as the time when some of the best fighters ever were competing in the heavyweight division, and unfortunately they never got their just due. And so we'll save the best for last. But let's start with a heavyweight rivalry, a trilogy, fittingly enough, Fury versus Wilder, a trilogy that some are saying is going to be remembered as one of the greatest of all time. I'm not sure about that. But this was a trilogy that really made a huge impression on the sport, was very consequential, and that being the trilogy of fights between Floyd Patterson and Ingemar Johansson of Sweden. And their fights took place back in the early 1950s, and they did have a huge impact on the sport in a number of ways. Hunter, what are when someone says Patterson versus Johansson, what immediately comes to your mind?
First thing I think of are knockdowns. They both treated each other as their own personal basketballs, and especially that first fight, Floyd was down 7 times in the 3rd round, I think, and it was a big shock. I mean, we all knew that Patterson had been somewhat protected as heavyweight champion, and that was just kind of a well-known thing. It was well-known even at the time. And Johansson, I don't know if he was really expected to do what he did, but he had that big right hand, and Patterson, while underrated in terms of his recuperative abilities, was nonetheless vulnerable to big punchers and even not so big punchers. And when Johansson finally landed a good shot and just blew him away, and it was the start of a tremendous rivalry, because Patterson got his return match and proceeded to give it right back to him. And this was just is one of those things that I know was considered exciting back then. I also know that a lot of people now tend to maybe underrate Patterson a little bit and don't even really rate Johansson that much. He's definitely known more for his lack of chin these days than anything else. Floyd is. And a lot of people remember him more for losing the Liston than anything else. But that was an exciting trilogy, and those two guys really, especially for people who were kind of known as gentlemen and, thought of in positive terms by the media then in the late 50s, early 60s, they nonetheless really went to war, and it was exciting. What are your thoughts on that trilogy?
Well, I agree 100%. All 3 of their fights were exciting fights. There's no question about it. Their styles meshed in a way that gave fans lots of excitement, lots of violence. I mean, the first fight at Yankee Stadium in 1959, it saw, well, the key thing to understand is that Ingemar Johansson was more or less an unknown. And Sweden is not exactly a country known for producing world-class fighters. At the same time, it was an attractive matchup, partly due to the fact that, Johansson was a highly ranked contender, but at the same time, a lot of people didn't know anything about him. So there was a sort of a mysterious factor, an intrigue factor. But he was a 5-1 underdog. And you can imagine the shock when he knocked Patterson down 7 times in the 3rd round, thanks to what he referred to as his thunder and lightning, and that being his deadly right hand. What I think sometimes goes, people overlook perhaps from that fight is the tremendous courage that Floyd Patterson exhibited. I mean, that's an exceptional fighter who gets up not just once or twice or 3 times, but 7 times. Floyd just kept climbing back up to his feet and then getting knocked down again. I mean, for me, that's something extraordinary. So that was a huge upset, and but Floyd came right back in the rematch, and the rematch has to count as one of the most remarkable and vicious one-punch knockouts in heavyweight history. As Floyd Patterson, who it's well known, he didn't exactly have a typical boxer's psyche. He was not known for really having a great killer instinct. But to regain the title, he had to show that kind of killer instinct, and he did when he landed a absolutely vicious flying left hook. He had a unique left hook, didn't he, Hunter? It was almost like a leaping left hook, and he would get all his weight behind it, and he landed a perfect shot on Ingemar Johansson in the rematch. It was a beautiful one-punch knockout. But as soon as Johansson was counted out, and it's a memorable knockout in part because Johansson was out cold and twitching. His legs were twitching on the canvas as he lay there. Floyd immediately, you could see it. He felt terrible about what he'd just done, and showed great concern for his fallen opponent. And then the key thing that has to be noted about that fight is that Floyd Patterson was the first fighter in the history of the heavyweight division to lose and then regain the heavyweight championship of the world. Many had tried, but none had succeeded until Floyd Patterson turned the trick. And of course, then that set up the trilogy fight between the two. And on the FightCity.com, we have a number of top 12 lists, which I think are very entertaining, and I encourage everybody to check out. And we have the top 12 all-time greatest opening rounds. And ranked on that list is the opening round of the third Patterson versus Johansson fight, because they traded knockdowns in that first round. So as you said, Hunter, they abused each other and used each other as punching bags, or their own personal fungo balls, and bounced each other off the canvas. And it's true, 7 knockdowns in the first fight, a clean knockout. And refresh my memory if you can, did Floyd go down in the rematch? I can't recall. But
go ahead, sorry.
No, please.
I know he was rocked in the rematch, but he was hit hard in the second. But he actually demonstrated a bit of he showed that he had some bone in his jaw and took it and kind of plowed through it. It was clear that he just would not be denied. I don't think he actually went down in the second. I know he went down in the third, but the second, I think he managed to kind of just will his way through and keep his feet. So one thing you mentioned that he was the first heavyweight champion to regain the heavyweight title, but he was also the 9th one to attempt it. So that, to me, is even more impressive. Jim Corbett tried it, Bob Fitzsimmons, Jeffries, Dempsey, Max Schmeling, Joe Louis, of course. Ezzard Charles tried 3 times. Walcott tried it. And almost all of them, it was worse each time they tried it. And it's impressive. Not only did he regain it, but he regained it after getting pasted in a short fight, and that's something that, as you said, he kept getting up, and he had such a will, and as you said, he did not have a fighter's mentality in a lot of ways. He didn't have that killer instinct. He was a guy who was known, as kind of a shy, gentle sort of person outside of the ring, and even in the ring, he didn't relish the violence. He fought, I think, in part because he was good at it, and he had a huge amount of just natural talent, physical and skill-wise, and it worked for him. But it was almost even more extraordinary because he wasn't a fighter in the sense of someone who enjoyed the violence and liked giving it. He wasn't like a Pacquiao who seemed to relish getting hit and hitting back, and. But he still had that warrior's mentality. We sometimes use phrases calling fighters warriors, and it's not quite the same. But of any sport, it's a lot. It's still more appropriate with boxing than any other sport. And he certainly was willing to pull that from inside himself. And yeah, when he came back, boy, did he come back. That's why some people, not everyone counted him out in his first fight with Liston, in part because, they saw what he was able to do against Johansson and in other situations where he'd been hurt.
Yeah, and a brief aside here, if we may. I mean, I think you would agree with me, Hunter, that Floyd Patterson counts as something of a underappreciated heavyweight because he's probably best remembered, unfortunately, undeservedly, for his defeats. Those being his knockout losses to Sonny Liston and then 2 losses to Muhammad Ali. And the fact of the matter is, after he lost the heavyweight title, and his reign as champion was not anything to dismiss. He defended the title a number of times against some viable contenders. Yes, he was protected to some degree. Cus D'Amato, it's well known, was not at all confident about his fighter's chances against Liston and tried to delay that fight as long as possible. But after he lost the title, his run is extraordinary. I mean, if you look at his record and look at the fighters that he defeated, both as champion and then afterwards, I mean, it's really actually I think one of the more remarkable records in the heavyweight division, and deserves. I've got a feeling that he just in general deserves to be ranked higher on everyone's lists of the all-time great heavyweights. But moving on, he won the heavyweight championship of the world after Rocky Marciano retired. And so it was a battle for the vacant title between himself and Archie Moore, and that allowed him to become world champion. Now, similarly, Joe Louis, the longest, well, perhaps no longer, I'm not sure. Is it still the longest? But in my book anyway, the most dominant reign as heavyweight champion. It's no doubt. It's still the longest. Okay, thank you, Hunter. 26 consecutive title defenses, I believe. Was it 25? Okay.
I think so, yeah.
Just remarkable. But after back-to-back wins over Jersey Joe Walcott, the first one being highly questionable, Louis retired. And after he retired, of course, there was a process by which to determine, okay, how do we find a new champion? And actually, there have been a number of bouts leading up to that point in time involving a number of different fighters. For example, Elmer Ray, Joe Baxkey, Rex Lane, a number of good contenders. But the two top names, the guys that were above the rest, were Jersey Joe Walcott, who, as mentioned, had back-to-back losses to Louis, and Ezzard Charles, the all-time great light heavyweight who had moved up to heavyweight. Now, they were set against each other to decide the successor to Joe Louis. And that set in motion another heavyweight rivalry that I think, Hunter, you would agree, is somewhat underappreciated now. Walcott and Charles, for me, represent two of the best heavyweights in history. I mean, maybe not top 10 necessarily, but they've got to be in your top 15. They're two great fighters. And Ezzard Charles, for me, pound for pound, is one of the all-time greats. So a 4-fight series between Walcott and Charles. And this is definitely a historic and remarkable heavyweight rivalry. Wouldn't you agree, Hunter?
Absolutely. It It was one of those that started out. I think there were fight fans at the time that were disappointed just because it was the end of an era. Joe Louis, who, as you said, had been so dominant for so long, and his 25 defenses, that was even, noting that he took off 3 years during World War II essentially and was inactive, and Jimmy Bivens was kind of recognized as sort of the interim champion while he was out, but it was Joe Louis, of course, who was the real guy, and so filling his shoes was what I think a lot of people were looking at, and that's hard to do. And while both Ezra Charles and Jersey Joe had some power and were certainly talented fighters, they weren't as big as Joe. They didn't have that knockout finishing ability. They didn't inspire people, and so. But they were still absolutely excellent fighters. And I will say Charles is actually in my heavyweight top 10 all time, and Walcott's definitely in the top 20. These two guys deserve probably more recognition than they get anymore. Walcott was started for a while as kind of a bit of a journeyman, actually, and it took, there's actually, I think, a story, an article on FightCity.com, the Cole for Christmas one. I think it's on Fight City. It's on. I've seen it online anyway.
It's on the Fight City. It's definitely on the Fight City, and I wrote it.
Excellent. So perfect. See, I remember things you do. And it kind of talked about how it helped, basically getting outside help allowed Walcott to focus on fighting and kind of develop into a top contender, which he eventually did. And he gave Joe Louis a scare, arguably deserving a win. And then, of course, getting knocked out in the rematch because Louis was good at that. But it definitely marked the beginning of the end for Joe. And then, so Charles and Walcott, they met in for the first time as part of an eliminator. It was in I think 49. It was actually, no, I know it was on 49 because it was on my birthday, June 22nd. Obviously a few years before I was born, but just a few. It was a pretty solid fight. It showed there's a lot of technical ability there, and it was for the vacant, at the time, the NBA, the National Boxing Association, which wasn't necessarily universally recognized. Even back then, there was a little bit of splintering of the title, but to a lot of people, this was for the marbles. And I don't think the Ring, for example, or some of the other commissions, like the New York State Athletic Commission, recognized it as the championship. But it certainly marked the winner was the best heavyweight in the world, regardless of whether or not he held the title. And Charles would go on to actually win it outright. And so that ended up setting up a rematch later on. And and then they fought a second time, and Charles won again. And sure enough, Jersey Joe kept beating contenders. So, why not go a third time? And that's when he got to make history.
Yes, and that third fight between Walcott and Charles is, it's one of the most extraordinary fights in the history of the division for more than one reason. Because Walcott was a huge underdog going into the third fight, even though both both of the first two fights in the series were competitive 15-round fights. In fact, there were some with the second fight who thought Walcott maybe deserved better. It was very close. But still, people at the time could not overlook the fact that Walcott was now 37 years old. Now, back then, 37 is ancient. And he's had 4 tries at the title. And at this point, people are just kind of like shaking their heads. He's snake bitten. There's no way he's going to finally do it. Not only does he do it, he does it in extraordinarily dramatic fashion with a one-punch knockout for the ages. It's a tight, competitive fight, but Walcott seems to have the edge in the third fight. He's fighting with a certain urgency, a certain ferocity that is not typical for Walcott. And in that 7th round, it's an extraordinary sequence. If you've never seen it, go to YouTube, look it up. that third fight, which I believe was in Pittsburgh, and they're in the corner, and the referee separates them, and then Walcott, he walks towards Ezra Charles in this nonchalant manner, sort of like, it's hard to describe, kind of like he's going for a stroll through the park or something, and kind of like rolling his shoulders as he does nonchalantly, and he's kind of looking aside, and then bang, he just lets this left hook out of nowhere go, and it connects full force on Charles' chin. And Charles is a very sturdy fighter, but this shot finished him. He went down. To his credit, he tried to get up. He couldn't beat the count. One of the most extraordinary one-punch knockouts in the history of the sport, I would argue, and it made Jersey Joe Walcott the heavyweight champion of the world at 37 years of age.
Yep. Not only, 37. He was at that point what became the oldest boxer to ever win the heavyweight championship. It'd take 43 years for that record to be broken. And it was, I believe that fight was also his fight of the year in 51 by Ring Magazine. It was spectacular. You're right. It was Pittsburgh. It was at Forbes Field. It was, and you mentioned how nonchalantly Walcott had this interesting sort of affect in the ring. He wouldn't, it would depend on the situation, but he had that famous like sort of walking away thing he would do. He'd kind of turn away and then pivot and hit you with a shot as he's turning back around. Yeah, and he would sometimes, walk toward an opponent, kind of hands down, looking like he's just taking a stroll. And it's he had a lot of sneaky tricks, and I think a lot of that was because he was a veteran of, he'd been around for so long at that point and had gone through everything. He had been a journeyman. He'd been a contender. This was, as you said, his fifth go around at the heavyweight title. And it was, at snake bitten maybe, but also, man, was he gaining experience. And it was a spectacular fight, a spectacular ending to the fight anyway. And then they had a fourth fight, and that went the distance. There were a lot of people who actually thought Ezra Charles deserved to win it. It was a close, competitive fight. Walcott certainly landed some good shots, and but I think a slight majority of the press at the time actually had Walcott had Ezra Charles the winner by a narrow decision, but Walcott got the win and defended his title and was 38 at that point, and would of course go on to face Marciano after. But a 4-fight rivalry is something that you don't see a lot anymore, maybe outside of someone like, Pacquiao Marquez or Vasquez Marquez, but a lot of Marquezes here. One notable thing about their fourth fight, Zach Clayton was actually the first African-American to referee a world title fight. So all three men in the ring were black, and which is a pretty big deal in 1952, so it was definitely some history making there as well.
Yeah, Zach Clayton, the referee who was most well known for being the third man in the ring for the Rumble in the Jungle, Ali versus Foreman in 1974. So I mean, when you chronicle the entire series of fights, in the end, you have to conclude that, okay, maybe not every match was fight of the year, but we're talking 4 highly competitive battles and 1 extraordinary knockout. I mean, this is a rivalry that definitely deserves more attention than it routinely gets. And I agree with you, Hunter. In my opinion, Walcott and Charles are 2 all-time greats. Walcott especially, I think, is underrated. When you look into the whole story of Walcott's career, it's a story of incredible, just a refusal to give up. Although he apparently retired many times. The boxing game almost drove him nuts. But everybody knew how talented he was. And part of it wasn't just his record and how many fights he had. It's also the fact that he was a sparring partner for some of the top guys. He was one of Joe Louis's sparring partners before he fought him at Madison Square Garden. So Walcott, I regard as one of the. I mean, he's a borderline top 10 great. That's how I look at him. He's got a number of losses. He was a bit inconsistent. But still, when we look at that rivalry, Walcott and Charles, that's a rivalry that deserves to be celebrated. And 4 great fights, 1 extraordinary knockout, and a great story, a great rivalry.
Definitely.
So, moving backward in time, and it's kind of interesting to end our discussion of Walcott versus Charles with noting that it was a extraordinary event to have Zach Clayton, the referee. Why was that extraordinary? Well, because race is an issue. Race is always an issue in America and always an issue in boxing. And so that final fight was the first time you had 3 black men in the ring in a heavyweight championship fight. And that is germane to the rivalries we want to talk about next, because we're going back in time to what you could refer to as the murderer's row of the heavyweight division, and an extraordinary time. So let's set the scene. I mean, Jack Johnson is the heavyweight champion of the world, and he's the first black heavyweight champion of the world. But it's sort of counterintuitive, isn't it? He was most reluctant to defend his title against other black fighters. In fact, he did not fight any black fighters until late in his championship reign. In 1913, he faced battling Jim Johnson. That was the first heavyweight championship fight between 2 black pugilists. And, of course, Jack Johnson won. That fight took place in Paris, France, as I said, in 1913. Otherwise, all of Jack Johnson's championship defenses were against guys like Stanley Ketchel and James J. Jeffries and Frank Moran. And he froze out from title contention primarily 4 truly great heavyweights, those being Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, Sam Langford, and Harry Wills. Those 4 guys deserved more than they got. They were 4 terrific fighters. And as a result, they ended up fighting each other multiple times. So when we're talking underappreciated or underrated heavyweight rivalries, we've got to talk about those 4 guys. Again, Sam McVeigh, Joe Jeanette, Sam Langford, Harry Wills. Where do you want to start with that, Hunter?
I'd say let's start with Sam Langford. Langford wasn't naturally a heavyweight. He was easily the smallest of the bunch. I think he was something on the order of 5'7", 5'8". He was kind of built like a little fire plug. He fought welterweight early on, even lighter, and was already kind of a top middleweight as he was rounding into his career. But he found he could hang with heavyweights, and he when he was near the beginning of his career, he fought Jack Johnson, and Johnson handled him, but even noted that this guy's going to be trouble. And I think part of the reason why Langford never got a shot against Johnson, against Sam Langford, never got a shot against Johnson as a champion, because he remembered that early bout. And Sam Langford was this just natural talent. He was short, but he was quick. He had ridiculous power. He was able to generate a lot of force. He fought all those guys. He probably had the best head-to-head record. Maybe Harry Wills did, but he between him and Jeanette and McVeigh especially, he won more than he lost against all of them. And they were all super talented. Langford was, and Langford was this guy who ended up, like a lot of fighters, fighting on too long. By the time the early 20s hit, he was basically blind in one eye and had to stop fighting when he went blind in the other one, and but was just this ridiculously talented guy. There's a little bit of footage of him, not a whole lot, but the footage, even so, that era, and I don't want to talk too long here before we really get into it, but I want to say that era especially was kind of a pioneering era, where from basically the first 2 decades of the 20th century, boxing in its professional kind of modern sense is really coming into its own. The first official heavyweight champion under the Queensberry rules was 1885, and by 1905, they were a lot of more modern. I wouldn't say modern in the sense that we think of them, but a lot of the techniques that we now think of in boxing had already kind of been developed and been worked out in fights, and the game was. There was still a lot about it that we'd find anachronistic. Now, there were fights scheduled for 45 or 50 or even more rounds. Sometimes there were fights to the finish where it would go all night. 70 or 80 rounds would happen because you had to go till somebody couldn't go anymore, and it was a very brutal time. And they'd fight. If you fought 5 times in a month, no one would be shocked at it. But Langford was kind of like the perfect guy for that era, and he was and he really kind of is one of my all-time favorites, but he's a guy who's known kind of as a pound for pound great even by modern fans, and I think that some of his compatriots there don't quite get enough love, like Jeanette and McVeigh. If you want to kind of start us off a little bit on that.
Well, I don't claim to be any kind of true expert, or I've never ever referred to myself as a boxing historian. However, I have spent some time reading up and learning about the careers of Sam Langford, Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, Harry Wills. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that all 4 at different points in time could have been world champion. They could have been the very top, the top guys, and then their rivalries, which I definitely their rivalries are underappreciated. I mean, and not fully documented. As you intimated, Hunter. I mean, the records are somewhat sketchy, but there's no doubt that, just as an example, Langford and Harry Wills fought at minimum a dozen times. And if you look at the records, you can make the case that they may have battled each other as often as 17 times. I mean, talk about a rivalry. Similarly, Langford and McVeigh. They both journeyed down to Australia at one point in their careers, I should say, and they both kind of did a tour of Australia and ended up fighting each other, like I think half a dozen times or so, and then of course they fought each other some more in the United States. And part of the reason they were fighting each other so often was it was the most lucrative option, given the fact that Jack Johnson refused to defend his title against any of them. And it should be noted as well that the fact that Jack Johnson was avoiding these guys was not unnoticed. And in fact, in Paris, France, where boxing was very popular and where they happened to be, if I can put it this way, less racist, boxing fans were actually, a bit pissed off about the fact that Johnson would not take on Langford or McVeigh or Jeanette, and McVeigh in particular, as I understand, was extremely popular in France.
Yes.
And all 3 of them fought each other in Paris more than once, and attracted much attention. And probably made great money, and probably had great times going to, the houses of ill repute in Paris while they were there, and they probably lived it up. In fact, I have no doubt in my mind they lived it up, something special while they were in Paris. And then, of course, April 17th, 1909. Now, that's the date that no one should ever forget, because that's the legendary fight to the finish between Joe Jeanette and Sam McVeigh. 48 full 3-minute rounds. I'll say that again. 48 3-minute rounds. Jeanette and McVeigh. And absolutely legendary. One of the last fights to the finish, where the bout did not end until somebody could no longer continue. And after 48 rounds, it was McVeigh's corner that finally threw in the towel. So that's another important point to make, because I've heard that, when you bring up the rivalries between Langford, McVeigh, Jeanette, Wills, somebody will inevitably say, well, yeah, but you don't know for certain if all those fights were on the level. You don't know for certain if they were really going all out. Well, we don't have any film to, we don't have full evidence. But there are photographs, there are accounts, there are first-hand accounts that you can look up, that you can read, and there are photographs from the 48-round Jeanette McVeigh war that clearly show the blood, the copious amounts of blood in the corners of the two fighters. I mean, these guys were fighting and they were going at it for real. And I don't think anybody was pulling punches. I mean, Langford has knockouts over Harry Wills. Harry Wills was a full-fledged heavyweight. He was like 215 pounds. Langford, as you noted, Hunter, was a smaller guy. He probably at his heaviest was like around 180 pounds, something like that. But Langford has knockouts over Wills. I mean, does anybody think that Wills was taking a dive? What for? What would be the point? These fights were on the level. They were vicious. These guys were going all out. And again, we're talking rivalries of 10, 12, or more fights each.
Definitely. And it's funny. Even if, and I agree. I don't think I don't think there was any situation where anyone threw a fight or anything like that. But even if there was a fight or two where they were carrying each other, Langford had 178 wins in his career. I mean, at least, that's what we've got documented. All these guys fought more than 100 times in their career. I think Wills might have been just shy of that, but these guys fought a lot, and they fought ridiculously tough competition. It wasn't just each other. Langford was fighting the top guys of the day, even because there were some white fighters who did not draw the color line, and he was knocking them out too. People like Porky Dan Flynn, which is a great name, Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. I love the names from this era too. Gunboat Smith. He fought all these basically badasses, and of course. It was, but they were also stuck because the best fighters were themselves, were Jeanette and McVeigh and Langford, and so who else are they gonna fight? They can't fight for the title. They as Jack Johnson had a couple times, more than once, where he had promised to fight to Langford and then pulled the football away like Lucy, and it never ended up happening, and much to Langford's chagrin. And yeah, maybe it's possible if one of them got a title shot, they might have lost against him, or maybe against Dempsey later on or something. We don't know, but they should have had the shot at least, and they definitely deserved it. just as you said, that war between Jeanette and McVeigh, 40 knockout in the 49th round, absolutely insane. Sam McVeigh at the time was a fire plug. He was a big guy for his era. He was, on the shorter side, 5'10" or so, but he was 200 plus solid pounds. He had at least, I think, 16 pounds on Jeanette, and was just a stockier, bigger guy with a lot of power. He was, kind of like a proto Tyson in his style. And Jeanette was more of kind of a slick, scientific style boxer. And Jeanette, they both kept knocking each other down and getting up over and over. And while that fight was kind of the legendary one, that was the one everyone should know, especially if they don't. Those guys fought at least 5 official times and probably a lot more. As you said, Sam McVeigh fought Langford 15 times minimum. Langford and Jeanette, of course, at least 14. But we've kind of talked a little less about Harry Wills, who came on a little later. Langford was, when Wills was kind of coming into his prime, was about the same time Langford was kind of coming out of his, same with Jeanette and McVeigh. And they developed, Langford and Wills developed quite a rivalry early on. And it was, as you said, the size difference is incredible. The Black Panther, Harry Wills, was 6'2" easily, maybe even a little taller, was early on fought maybe 210, 215, but got heavier as he got older and was just a big, solid guy. That was huge for that era, especially. I've written a little bit actually about Harry Wills' career and how he's just kind of, I've always argued, underrated as a heavyweight. He had a run after, because he had, kind of some growing pains when he first started his career, and, was learning on the job, and he was fighting these monsters like McVeigh and Jeanette and so on. But once he kind of got on a roll and got going, he ended up going virtually undefeated for a run of about, it was something like a decade. And there's a good argument that from, in fact, I think I wrote it down here. Yeah, from after a 19th round knockout loss to Sam Langford in February 1916, all the way until October 1926, Harry Wills had a record of 58, 2, 3, and 3. And this was against, again, all these immensely talented fighters. Only 2 losses. One was a fluke injury, and the other was a DQ that he rematched 4 days later, which is not a schedule you'll see anymore.
Unbelievable.
Incredible, yeah. And Harry Wills was occasionally talked about as an opponent for Dempsey. I think Dempsey was a little more interested than his management was, but even Dempsey acknowledged that would have been a fight. And Dempsey himself had said he thought he probably would have lost to Langford had that fight ever happened, and at least had he fought a prime Langford. And he kind of came on in his career at the tail end of Langford's too. But and Dempsey was no dummy. He knew that these, while he didn't necessarily draw an official color line, it was still basically enforced, and he knew the risks. Someone like Harry Wills could have taken that title from him in 1920, for example, and held it for, at least half of the next decade. And I would not have been shocked by that. And it would have taken someone, I'm not even sure someone like Gene Tunney would have beaten him. It would have probably been near the end of the decade that he finally, I think, lost against Sharkey later in like around 27 or so, but when he was getting old. But that's what it took. Another Hall of Famer, a much younger Hall of Famer, taking him down, and kind of the way the boxing world works. Eventually, the young lions take out the old.
Well, yes, it should be noted, I think, that there was a brief. Well, when I say brief, we're talking like a year and a half, 2 years maybe, when Harry Wills was, I don't like, it's difficult in my opinion to argue against this idea. Harry Wills was the best heavyweight in the world. Jack Dempsey was not active. He was not defending his title, and the public was actually clamoring for a Dempsey versus Wills showdown. It was widely recognized that Wills was the most deserving contender, but what was overlooked perhaps at the time was that Wills was no spring chicken. He was getting old himself. He was in his early to mid 30s, and so unfortunately, and it should be noted, Dempsey signed a contract. Dempsey signed a contract to fight Wills. It was supposed to happen. And so Dempsey deserves some credit. He was willing, there's no reason to think otherwise. He was willing to fight Harry Wills. And it would have been a huge fight. But the problem, according to Dempsey himself, was you just couldn't find any backers for it. The whole idea of there being another black heavyweight champion at that point in time just scared the shit out of everybody after the, incredibly tumultuous reign of Jack Johnson. I mean, people now may forget, but I mean, there were full-scale race riots that took place after Jack Johnson defeated James J. Jeffries. People died. People were murdered. I mean, nobody wanted to go through anything that was going to cause that kind of unrest in the United States. And so when Tex Rickard and Dempsey and company, they, as I understand it, they tried to put together a Jack Dempsey versus Harry Wills fight, and they just couldn't find any support for it. But as you noted, Hunter, a Jack Dempsey versus Sam Langford fight could have happened. But Dempsey himself was very open about the fact that he wanted nothing to do with Langford. And he is on record as saying, Langford probably would have knocked me out. So that's how good these guys were. When we're talking Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, Harry Wills, and Sam Langford, we're talking in my opinion, four of the all-time greats in the heavyweight division. And it's a damn shame that none of them got a chance at the top prize, the World Heavyweight Championship. They all deserve that. And, there's no reason to shed a tear for example, Harry Wills. He went on to have a successful business. He had a successful car business of some kind. He was renting cars or repairing cars. He did very well. He was in real estate. He invested in real estate. He did very well for himself. And, no, I'm getting mixed up. It was Joe Jeanette who did well in the car business, and it was Harry Wills who did well in the real estate business. Both were well off after their boxing careers. And then Langford, he was not so well off, but he had no regrets. He against doctors' advice, he kept fighting, even though they assured him that if he did, he would end up blind in both eyes. He didn't care. He kept fighting. I mean, he must have had, when you take all the official bouts and unofficial bouts, he had something like, somewhere between 300 and 400 fights. Just ridiculous. And later on, he claimed to have absolutely no regrets whatsoever. He enjoyed his career. And Sam McVeigh, he died young. So, not much to be said about that. But while, at the same time, just to repeat myself, all four deserved greater opportunities, and it's a damn shame that they were denied those opportunities for the simple fact that they happen to be black. And you would think that we'd learned something since then. We would have overcome this ridiculous prejudice about race, but God, we're still struggling with it.
Oh, definitely, yeah. That's a whole other topic. To get into the history of racism in sport and then outside of sport, of course, it's been covered by smarter people than myself, of course. But yeah, the legacy goes back forever, and it's certainly marred and shaped so much of the careers of especially these four that we spoke of. And we know them in part because of the adversity they went through. But it would have been nice if they lived in just a little bit more just world, and had those shots that they really wanted and they had earned. So, but here we are, and it's 100 plus years later, and things have improved in some ways, and in other ways, there's a long way to go, and we keep striving forward the best we can, and at least recognize those who struggled in the past, because that's important to be able to the whole thing about the Santa Ana quote about those who don't remember the sins of the past are destined to repeat them, and that's something, not just the sins but the greats of the past too, we need to remember, because they deserve it. So
yeah, and yeah, I actually take some comfort from the fact that here we are more than 100 years later, and the names of those 4 great fighters are not forgotten. And so I think that about wraps it up. So our discussion on underrated heavyweight rivalries, we looked back at Floyd Patterson versus Ingemar Johansson, Jersey Joe Walcott versus Ezra Charles, and then the great rivalries between Sam Langford, Joe Jeanette, Harry Wills, and Sam McVeigh. And we hope you've enjoyed our discussion. And we're signing off now for Fight City Podcast.
Expect a tough, clean fight. Protect yourself at all times. Any questions from the challenger?